Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.
Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing how the state's law enforcement can now round up criminals who run from them, the nationwide search for an electric ferry builder, Spokane officials paying out a man killed by police in a standoff, and trouble for Seattle's infamous Hellcat driver. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. A major shift happens this weekend in Washington. Police in the state for years now have been kept from pursuing a suspect in a vehicle when they flee. Thanks to hundreds of thousands of signatures and a legislature and governor willing to yield to the wishes of those citizens, law enforcement can once again catch these suspects. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson had our latest story on this. First off, Carlene, give us the parameters of what police could not do before that they're now able to do.
Yeah, the law up until the Thursday change in state law basically said any law enforcement officer would have to have probable cause of a crime having been committed. And even at that point, then the officer would have to get permission from a supervisor before they could pursue. So even if the clerk at 7-Eleven calls and says robbery in progress, and the cop rolls up, sees a guy jump out, run out of the front of the store and jump into a car and take off, that officer was not permitted to pursue.
And now when this law was initially passed, supporters of this pointed to statistics saying police chases were extraordinarily deadly affairs. And this was before you joined us, Carlene, but the Center Square uncovered evidence that the data that they did use was actually questionable. And it led to a series of, stories that we had put out about the data, one being in question, two being suddenly taken down, and then came back up and seemed to be much more watered down. Give a quick recap of the whole saga behind the deadly police chase data.
Well, as you mentioned, so much of that data was then called into question, suddenly yanked down, thanks in large part to the Center Square's reporting. But you have to realize that, let's go back to 2021, right? When the change came to severely restrict police pursuits. That was part of the whole, post Black Lives Matter protests and the defund police movement. And that 2021 law change was just one of a package of so-called police reforms, as if police officers were out there just pursuing willy-nilly, taillights out. So an officer's going to pursue. Well, all that proved to be completely false. That was not happening. And officers, even now with the loosening of restrictions, say, the arguments against this, that they're going to, pursue somebody at 100 miles an hour down I-5 because they see an expired tab. I mean, that's just bunk. It never happened before, and it's not going to happen now.
And we also saw in the aftermath, since that law had been passed, you had seen statistics of people fleeing police skyrocket.
Out of control. Yeah, I spoke to Federal Way Mayor Jim Farrell, longtime former King County prosecutor, and this has been, something he has been passionate about for years, banging the drum, going, and they didn't defund any of their officers. In fact, while other departments in the region were, eliminating officer positions or not hiring, they were seeing the massive uptick in crime. And even before, this is interesting too, Cole, even before this law took effect this week, the change, loosening the pursuit restrictions, Mayor Farrell told me that they've seen a 39% decrease in vehicle theft year over year, because he says, as he puts it, the bad guys know that things are changing back to where they used to be. He called this just an absurd social experiment, and lives have been lost.
Right. You had a very emotional interview with a woman who contends that her daughter would still be alive today if not for the police being kept from chasing suspects, right?
Right. It was January 15th of 2022, 12-year-old Immaculée Goldade and her best friend Kathleen. It was a Saturday morning. They walked from their home in the Pierce County area, Immaculee's home, to go to the nearby school to play on the playground equipment. They were walking back home about 10:30, and they went a different route than they normally would because they saw a possum in the road that wasn't quite dead, as Mom describes it. So they got a little freaked out, went a different way, busier road. No sidewalks, but there was a fog line. The girls were well off of the side of the road when a man who was driving a stolen landscaping truck, one that he had stolen just a couple of weeks before, plowed them down, killed Immaculée instantly, and grievously wounded Kathleen. Now he's in prison, but it was 2 weeks prior when this same man, 32-year-old Terry Cole, broke into that landscaping business and was rummaging through stuff. They had the guy. But when he took off from there, guess what? They could not pursue.
Yeah.
And 2 weeks later, Immaculée is dead.
Now, Carlene, tell us about the effort that eventually led to the pursuit law being rescinded.
Yeah, this is a citizen effort. This is one of the 6 initiatives led by Let's Go Washington that were sent to Olympia this legislative session. And lawmakers looked at this and went, there's so much overwhelming support to change this back and let police do their jobs and untie their hands, that they went ahead and passed it. Now, there are still folks that are saying, we're going to be watching really closely and make sure police aren't out of control. And, if the evidence shows that somehow this swings the pendulum back too far the other direction, they promise that they'll hold law enforcement agencies accountable.
Well, yeah, that interview had to have been heart-wrenching. Thank you for doing that. Those are always very, very tough, but important interviews. So thank you, Carlene. From cars to ferries we go. The State Department of Transportation has put out the Help Wanted sign in their search for someone to build them some ferries. But as investigative reporter TJ Martineau wrote this week, there's a stipulation in that request. What is so special about these ferries, TJ?
Well, the difference between what the ferries that they're trying to build and the ones they have now is that the ones they have now are diesel, and they're trying to switch over to a hybrid electric. So it's a very different type of boat that they're going to have built.
So it's still going to be run on presumably diesel fuel or like liquid natural gas or something, but it's not the same kind of boat, of vessel that is more prevalent today in terms of ferries. And the Sound area has the largest ferry service in the country, if I'm not mistaken. And the issue now is that some of these are going out of service, and the lack of vessels has led to some serious problems in terms of people being able to get to work, right?
Right. Before they had, I believe, 21 vessels, and now they're down to 14. So, which means that they've had to cancel thousands of sailings, at least last year. There was more than 3,000 canceled sailings. So it's not just a crew shortage, but it's also the lack of vessels. And so that's the context of this situation where they're trying to have these boats built to expand the fleet, but they're also trying to switch the way that they're powered.
And for context too, this is not just, people jumping on the ferry to go sightseeing. This is not like a purely tourist function of the Washington ferries. These are, people live on islands. And in terms of getting to work, if they do not work on the same island or have the, privilege of working remotely, they rely on these ferries to get themselves to and from work and support themselves. And when you're seeing, we've seen reports about how there's, one ferry a day going to and from the mainland back to some of these islands, you have people's livelihoods at risk. And so there's an urgent need for these ferries. But my question then is, why not just commission some new diesel ones, which would obviously not take as much time, and there would be more there would be more companies that have the ability to supply them?
Well, it depends on who you ask. The argument that proponents of the hybrid electric, their argument is that they're too far in the process with what they're doing now to turn around. To borrow an analogy, the ship doesn't exactly turn on a dime. And so you're having to, and what I mean by that is they'd have to go back to the legislature and come up with some approval for the construction of new diesel vessels. And so they claim it would delay implementation of this plan by 2 years. But what that's ignoring is that they chose to go down this path rather than just stick with diesel. So it's really a question of the context of at what point in the process we're at. So to borrow another analogy, the ship has sailed is kind of what they're arguing. But the question is whether that ship should have set sail to begin with.
Right. They knew the urgent need for these ferries was there. They didn't just lose 7 vessels overnight. It wasn't a situation where it was just a sudden problem. And they knew that there was going to be a longer lead time to get these hybrid ferries completed and out on the water to actually stem some of these service problems. It doesn't sound so much like a timeline issue. It sounds like an issue of politics where they wanted to make sure that these were hybrid and partially diesel, not fully diesel. And that's probably the only way that they got some of those more progressive votes, is the thought. But also, I think, too, you mentioned in your story, this is funded by tax dollars that only allow for environmental type issues. And the diesel engine ran ferries might just not be applicable there, right?
Yeah, what we're seeing is the impacts and effects of state legislation and also of just the politics that are going on, where there's people who are, their mindset is we need to get more ferries out there and expand our fleet or rebuild the fleet back to its prior capacity. And then there's others who are who have used this as an opportunity to push a political agenda of electrifying the transportation sector and including the public transportation fleet. And so the conversations about whether or not this is a good idea or whether this is the best policy, that was probably something that, practically speaking, should have occurred when they were coming up with the approval and authorization for WSDOT to actually go ahead with this. So that's where it's a weird situation for them to say, well, we'd have to turn, like, it was going to take longer to do diesel. Well, at this point, yes, but back when you were giving the authorization, it wasn't. But what legislators have said is this was what's the right word for it? There was compromise. They would have to go back and convince key legislators to change. And I think that that's acknowledging the political landscape in Olympia right now, where if you're trying to get something done, there are people who are going to use that as an opportunity to advance an environmental agenda.
Yeah, which makes sense. Horse trading for ferries. Has the state said how much more money or time it's going to take to get these hybrid ferries into the water?
This is what they're hoping. This is what they're aiming for, is they want to get 2 out in 2028, 2 out in 2029, and then the final one in 2030. But they are hoping to get 16 total over the next 16 years.
So they're years away from getting these things. I mean, this isn't a solve now issue. This will be a number of years before they find themselves in a position where they can put these things in the water. Wow. Okay. Thank you, TJ. In Spokane, city leaders have decided to pay a settlement to a family of a man killed in an armed standoff with police. The decision to do so saw broad support, but it also seemed like nobody was really happy about it. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Clouser covered the decision. Tell me about how the city got to this point, Tim.
Yeah, Cole, like you said, this all stems from an incident in 2022 when officers responded to Peterson Camo's home and found him in crisis. Camo was holding his 2-year-old nephew at the top of the staircase with a knife in his hands. When officers said they then shot and killed him when they saw him pouring fuel on the carpet and thought he was going to light it. Spokesman Review reported that when it happened, that the family then filed a tort claim for $23 million in damages, alleging that the officers had shot him 4 times in the left side of his back and twice in his mid-back. It didn't take the necessary time to de-escalate the situation.
And so the family sued, seeking these tens of millions of dollars. And my question is now, does this $250,000 mean that they'll no longer be seeking all of that money?
Yeah, Cole. So while the family did file that tort claim back in 2022, they've since went back on that decision, saying that they don't want to relive the trauma in a trial atmosphere. So the Camo Estates attorneys met with the city's attorneys, and they came to an agreement over this $250,000 settlement. So now that the city council has approved it, the tort claim the settlement voluntarily dismisses the family's tort claim.
Okay. So it does put an end to the actual tort claim. Thank you. In their deliberations on the settlement in the hearing, it sounded like some of the city council members were worried about the message that this is going to send to the police force.
Yeah, that was the worry of some council members, that a settlement would put more stress on the officers who would then hesitate in similar situations in the future. And it's notably, those officers were never found guilty of anything in relation to Camo's death. But some of them see the settlement as an admission of guilt, which was brought up during city council on Monday. The city council president, Betsy Wilkerson, however, favored the settlement and dismissed those claims, noting that the situation simply saves the family of any additional trauma that they might experience in court. But regardless, Spokane saved a lot of money that it would have otherwise spent on fighting this in court if it weren't for this $250,000 settlement.
Now, how does Spokane compare to other cities in terms of this type, police-involved shootings or police-involved violence? I don't know the exact name for the metric, but where does Spokane fall in terms of per capita violence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, earlier this year, an organization called Mapping Police Violence actually ranked Spokane among other cities per population as having one of the highest rates of officer-involved shooting that resulted in deaths. Other cities along Spokane that ranked similarly included Albuquerque, St. Louis, Tulsa, Phoenix. And since 2024, 6 people have actually been killed by law enforcement in Spokane County. So while that number is not astronomically high in relation to the population, it is high, taking into account other cities. Spokane County sheriffs were the agency who killed 2 of those people, while Spokane's police department killed 3 other people. Additionally, SPD had 2 other officer-involved shootings since January 2024, though those incidents didn't result in any deaths. Though one thing I think that's notable in regard to this settlement is that 2 years ago, Spokane paid out one of its highest settlements ever, paying $4 million to one family after police shot and killed a man who was reported to be drunk firing at his neighbor's house. However, he never had a gun. Additionally, the city paid a pedestrian, I believe it was last year, almost $1 million after they almost died crossing Division Street in North Spokane. And just last February, just a few months ago, the city paid another woman $275,000, so more than this settlement, after she fell into a grate and sustained serious injuries. So despite her only sustaining serious injuries and not dying at all, she was granted a larger settlement than Camo's estate.
Interesting. Yeah, being a police officer in a major metro is one of those professions that I just, you can't say enough in terms of how much you respect those guys, because it's just, I mean, beyond the fact of the liability issue, I mean, you are in real danger at any given point. So it's definitely a position that is worthy of respect, but there's controversy surrounding it all the time. Thank you, Tim. Our final story is not about a city being sued, but a city suing a car owner. A car that was so loud you could hear it from quite a ways away. Our Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly is one of those Seattle residents that had the chance to hear the roar of the city's infamous Hellcat, meaning the model of the car. Now, just how loud is this vehicle, Spencer?
Well, Cole, I can tell you it's extremely loud based on my own personal experiences. And I live a neighborhood away from downtown area where this driver is from. One comment on a social media page said his car sounds like Afghanistan. So take that. Yeah, make what you want of that. But I think a better way to answer your question of how loud this car is lies in court documents. In one instance back in March, the Hellcat driver, 20-year-old Miles Hudson, was pulled over by the Seattle Police Department. An officer had a decibel meter standing directly behind the vehicle while it was just parked and sitting idling. Yeah, and the meter clocked in between 84 and 87 decibels, which is just a few notches under the city's code's legal limit of 95 decibels. And that's just sitting there.
That's just idling. That's not. Yes. That's not actually giving it any gas. So the guy who owns this has gotten some notoriety out of having a car that sounds like a freight train coming down the street too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He's getting a lot of haters on social media, I suppose. You know, going on his Instagram page, his comments are calling him out for disturbing him because he drives this thing at 2 a.m. For his Instagram page to create content videos, regarding this Hellcat. On Reddit, you'll see more, and you're starting to see residents come together and find ways to get him in trouble. Last week, I saw a post in which someone showed that they found that he was parked in a handicap spot. So they called the police and got his car towed.
Oh, no. So what did the city do to try and get this guy's muffler fixed? I mean, this is not just, it just wasn't initially a suit. They didn't just up and sue the guy. I mean, this has been a long process, right?
Oh, yeah. Since last year, this SPD has pulled him over, given him citations, verbal warnings. And in response, Seattle City Attorney Ann Davison filed a lawsuit on behalf of the city demanding, he needs to restore his vehicle to a less noisy condition by April 15th. And he has yet to respond. Part of this lawsuit is Davison required Hudson to pay $1,500 in fines every day after that April 15th deadline. So
now where are we with the fines at this point? I mean, if he still hasn't responded.
We're somewhere between $60,000 to $70,000 in fees based off of the last time we've heard, an update of how much he owes, which is around $60K.
And it turns out he parks this thing and heads down into his mom's basement, right? This is not just his car. It could be getting mom in trouble.
I would say that's probably the most notable detail of this case when I found it, is that Miles Hudson's mother is also a registered owner of the Hellcat. And I think that pleased a lot of residents when they found that out. However, I can't say Hudson lives in his mom's basement.
I can't confirm.
I cannot confirm that. On his social media page, he promotes his Hellcat, but he also shows his high-rise apartment that shows a beautiful view of Puget Sound. Now, whether if he can afford that through his Instagram page or if his mother is financially supporting his lifestyle, we don't quite know yet. But yeah, much to the chagrin, he's
unbelievable.
His mom's also involved in this case.
It's crazy that we have to spend taxpayer dollars just to get somebody to not have a car muffler that sounds like Afghanistan, as it was said. It absolutely blows my mind. But thank you, Spencer, for hunting that one down, and good luck. Hopefully you get some sleep here in the future. A big thank you to all of our journalists for sharing their stories this week. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.